and the people of Venezuela have honored his request. Those who speculated that perhaps Maduro might water down the Bolivarian revolution got a clear message of how he will govern. These past 2 weeks, the government under Maduro's leadership brilliantly sidestepped an attempted coup without falling into the trap of using excessive force, which is what the enemies hoped to provoke in order to justify external intervention, which they were openly hoping for. The empire and its lackeys believed that the death of President Chavez was the time to overthrow the government once again. And leading up to the elections on April 14th, they repeatedly sabotaged the electricity grid. They artificially withdrew food from the markets. They brought in paramilitary terrorists from El Salvador. They spread outrageous rumors and tried to discredit the electoral process. And after the elections, which were close due to larger absenteeism, Maduro won by just under 300,000 votes. But the leader of the opposition cried fraud. In the face of the testimony of hundreds of international observers, UNASUR, Mercosur, the Carter Center, and many other organizations validated the process. All the countries in the world have recognized Maduro as president, except the United States. The opposition leader went on TV to openly call upon his followers to violent protest. This is what he said: "Go out into the streets and show your rage." He further told them that the boxes of votes were being hidden in the public clinics, the Barrio Adentro public clinics. The result was that 10 people died. One was a 5-year-old indigenous little girl, and 178 were injured. 19 of the popular clinics of Barrio Adentro were attacked and set on fire. And even the home of the head of the Elections Council, Tibisay Lucena, was attacked. The authorities have detained many of the perpetrators of these crimes. And I must tell you these things because the international press never reports the violence unleashed by the Venezuelan opposition. Most importantly, a US citizen who had been directing them and handing out $95 million to the saboteurs has also been caught, and actually caught on videos which he himself filmed. The United States is quick to call the Boston Marathon bombers, 2 teenagers, terrorists. It was a terrible thing. But they openly support the terrorism of Capriles and the Venezuelan opposition. All of Venezuela's elections these past 14 years have suffered from the interference of the CIA and the illegal pipeline of dollars that NED and the USA and the Republican and Democratic institutes pour into bogus NGOs and the opposition parties. The US empire has from the start been the opposition in Venezuela. President Hugo Chavez, whose ideas and accomplishments have touched and inspired millions of people, was undisputedly the most famous political leader of his time. He was beloved by Venezuelans, whose lives he dramatically improved, and by Latin Americans, whom he united in the path of integration and solidarity, and by the humble people all over the world who identified with him. But he was also the most maligned, the most demonized and slandered politician in the world, perhaps except for Fidel. Yet he never declared war, never invaded another country, or tried to overthrow it. Venezuela has no secret police, no clandestine prisons, no displaced populations, no death sentence, no torture, no significantly large army. Its economy is thriving. Its population enjoys strongly backed public services. Yet the United States and its allies, of course including the Harper government and international press, launched all kinds of vitriol against President Chavez for 2 main reasons. First, Venezuela has the largest deposit of oil in the world, and it took control of the state oil company, PDVSA. It increased royalties and taxes for foreign oil companies and made all oil exploitation a joint partnership with the state, having the majority of the shares. For 60 years, the oil companies had only paid 1% royalty. They now have to pay 16% plus high taxes. Out of every dollar generated by the mixed companies, 94% stayed in Venezuela. I wish that was the same case as in Alberta and President Chavez believed that the oil belonged to the people of Venezuela, not the multinational corporations nor the elite of the country. And the oil workers who actually saved the company from saboteurs during the oil lockout of 2002 are some of the most fervent supporters of the Bolivarian Revolution. The second reason for all this malign, I would say, vibes and activities towards Venezuela is that the Bolivarian Revolution represents a new model of development that rejects neoliberal economics and corporate capitalism. It believes the economy should serve the people, not the other way around, and it works. The Bolivarian Revolution, established through votes, not violence, is the only revolution in history that actually has the funds to carry out its social and economic transformation. For 40 years, the majority of Venezuelans were kept marginalized and impoverished by a racist, corrupt elite that controlled the immense riches of Venezuela. There was 70% poverty, illiteracy, rampant malnutrition, decrepit schools and crumbling hospitals. Inflation and unemployment coexisted, while the elites and their satellites lined their pockets in an orgy of wealth and corruption. And at the time of capitalist triumphalism, when it was most unpopular to even speak of socialism, Hugo Chavez asked his people to vote to approve the project for developing in Venezuela a socialism of the 21st century, economic, humanist, pluralist, spiritual, not beholden to failed European experiments, rooted in the communitarianism of the indigenous peoples, justified by the cosmologies of the population, with an ideology that owes as much to Bolívar, Martí, Zamora, and Rodriguez, as well as to Marx and Engels. Thus, Venezuela became the dangerous example that unmasked the hideous failure of corporate capitalism. It's geared towards genuine development, that is, to human happiness, through social investment, participatory democracy, social autonomous enterprise, and combating inequality. The result of 14 years of the Bolivarian Revolution is evident by the statement of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean that declared Venezuela to be now the least unequal country of the region according to the Gini coefficient, having reduced inequality by 54%. Poverty levels are at 21% and extreme poverty dropped from 40% to 7.3%. Infant mortality has been reduced from out of every 1,000 babies, 25 would die, and now it's 10 over 1,000. The Chavez government eliminated illiteracy and provided free public education, housing, and health services. And in all of this, it has been greatly helped by the solidarity and the expert teachers and doctors from Cuba. Cuba and Venezuela has shown the world what true solidarity between nations and peoples really is. And the result of this help is that in one decade, Venezuela advanced 7 places in the UN Human Development Index. And 3 unassailable studies attest to Venezuela's happiness. It's tied with Finland as the 5th happiest country in the world, according to the Gallup poll. It's the 1st happiest country in South America and the 2nd in Latin America, according to the World Happiness Report, and the 9th happiest country in the world, according to the Happy Planet Index. And yet, they go on about Venezuela being a dictatorship. The constitution that the people of Venezuela ratified redeemed the country as a participatory democracy, ensuring that the majority would make political decisions, especially through the communal councils. Chavez may well have reinvented and saved a democracy, His enemies accuse him of polarizing the country as if the divide between the haves and have-nots had been his doing. In fact, he politicized the country. Citizens now know the Constitution and know their human rights. There are 30,000 communal councils who are overseeing the social investments. And the workers' rights are enshrined and encouraged. Key industries have been nationalized. The agrarian reform has increased ownership and production. There are 50,000 cooperatives in the country, run by women, by fishermen, by agriculturalists, by city dwellers, as well as a plethora of worker-owned and managed enterprises of all types. And Article 91 of the Constitution mandates that the minimum wage shall be adjusted every year to guarantee access to basic necessities of all the workers. A few weeks ago, Margaret Thatcher died. But Thatcherism did not die. And we watched with the same sort of morbid fascination with which one would see a ship slowly sinking as the neoliberal policies and the austerity measures she championed continue to wreak havoc with the working peoples of the North. As she destroyed the British miners, she claimed that 4 unions had a stranglehold on her country, which she was determined to break, which she did. Then, by privatization and deregulation, she handed the destiny of Britain into the control of the financial sector. And we all know how uncaring that sector is. The financial crisis that has been occurring in the richer countries of the North these past 6 years has been met with deep antagonism against workers, their unions, and the general population. The elites are using the great excuse of the supposed need for austerity to cut necessary programs and to undermine the labor movement. And as always, they use the power of the law to do so. The financial crisis of 2006 also affected Venezuela as the oil prices dropped. But the socialist nature of the Bolivarian government solidly stood for an economy that would serve the people. Thus, poverty reduction continued on, and it was reduced by 50% from 2003. The country's Human Development Index continued to rise, despite the contraction of the economy, and the salaries continued to increase by 17%. And in contrast to the firing of employees and increasing unemployment that the European and North American governments promote, the Bolivarian government protected employment as a basic strategy to counter the crisis. So despite the serious oil drop, prices of the oil that dropped, and the contraction of the economy, unemployment decreased from 7.5 in 2009 to 6% today. The formal jobs have increased, informal jobs have decreased. The minimum wage has increased by 22% on average and is lower than the inflation rate. Technical education programs all over the country have trained thousands of workers in 44 technical professions. 20 new free universities have been created, and the country has one of the highest enrollments in the region. And the economy continues to grow at an average that has ranged from 2.5 to 5% of GDP. Venezuela is certainly a dangerous example for the hegemony of corporate capitalism. The strategy of the Bolivarian Revolution has been to respond to the crisis with social investment, not austerity. This is stark contrast to trying to fight the crisis on the backs of the workers and the people, blaming the welfare state and the unions instead of aggressive capitalist competition, the overaccumulation of capital, the hegemony of financial elites, and their unethical speculation that have impacted the real economy. There is a clear link between social injustice and capital accumulation. There are two things that symbolize to me the difference between the ideologies of Margaret Thatcher and Hugo Chavez. When I was a graduate, first thing is that when I was a graduate student in England, Margaret Thatcher had just been named Minister of Education, and one of her very first decisions was to eliminate the free milk program in schools that provided milk to every British child. That earned her the nickname of Thatcher the Milk Snatcher. That's how she was known. In contrast, President Chavez established hot breakfast and lunches plus nutritious afternoon snacks in all schools, thus practically eliminating child malnutrition. Secondly, and most sinister, Thatcher famously said, and I quote, "There is no society, only individuals." This attitude brought about an era of unbridled individualism and economic greed took hold of the northern capitalist countries. In contrast, Hugo Chavez was the catalyst for sweeping solidarity in the Latin American region. He urged unity of the nations, just as Simón Bolívar urged it 200 years ago, and as being the only shield against powerful nations. Hugo Chávez's efforts indeed integrated the region, doing away with the Monroe Doctrine of U.S. imperialism. He was the recognized architect of the infrastructure for the integration of Latin America, not just for purely commercial aims, but for solidarity in facing common social economic challenges and to protect the sovereignty of the countries. CELAC is displacing the OES. UNASUR stands for its defense. Petrosur and Petrocaribe ensure energy supply to the region. Telesur and Radio del Sur for communication. Mercosur and ALBA help with development. And Banco del Sur and Banco del Alma aim to displace the IMF and the World Bank. So, my friends, Venezuela is no longer a backwater, and Latin America is no longer a backyard. The world now knows that a better world, and certainly a more socialist world, is certainly possible if there is political will, and it is being born in Venezuela and Latin America, and with the help of Cuba. The Bolivarian Revolution will outlive Hugo Chávez because it is essentially grounded in its working people, which were his roots and are also the roots of Nicolás Maduro. Thank you very much for inviting me here today.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much, Maria.